We'll go ahead and get started. I think some folks are still trickling in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our HashiCorp Migrating from OSS to Enterprise webinar. Today, HashiCorp Field CTO Michael Wood is going to discuss how and why customers move from OSS HashiCorp products to supported and managed or enterprise distributions. I want to note that the session is recorded and the recording will be made available after post-processing. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's wonderful to get a chance to speak with you. I will be walking through every time I consider something like this, I want to bring something maybe that's not straight documentation. So what I'm going to work on here is giving you some sense of, I've seen a lot of customers that have been moving from various versions of various products, I would say, that are using OSS and moving over to enterprise for many, many different reasons. Some of them, obviously, there are features that enable that move. We're going to hit on some of those. I'm not going to be listing features. I'm going to be talking about why we start to look at enterprise functionality over OSS generally across the three main products that we're going to be talking about today: Consul, Terraform, and Vault. I'm going to give you some sense of where I see the struggle in that move. Not all of it is going to be technical. And so I want to call out some things that I think would be useful to you as you consider the move. And then at the end, I will point you to guides with specific step-by-step kinds of things. We've had numerous webinars that will walk through migrating Vault and moving into Vault Enterprise, and then there's a document I'll share that will walk you through the technicals of migrating to Consul OSS, but this is not really a workshop style implementation focused presentation. It's going to be focused on why are we moving to enterprise, and often that move to enterprise has to do with we're trying to do something different organizationally, and there are organizational concerns that I think are often overlooked that lead to either stagnant moves where we've introduced, let's say, Terraform Enterprise, but we're not driving a lot of consumption and we're running into a lot of headwinds. I'm going to talk about how do we overcome those things and how do we consider and collaborate well to drive successful implementations of enterprise and what those benefits tend to yield. I will get to I'll call out some of the benefits, and we'll never be able to cover all of the outcomes and benefits and customer stories. I'm primarily going to share customer stories of folks who I've had the chance to work with. I'll abstract the names and everything. I'm much more interested in the implementation patterns so that you get a sense of what will prove more successful for you. And the reason I'm going to focus primarily on Terraform, Consul, and Vault is those have been the most broadly adopted outside of, Packer and Vagrant certainly, but there's not really, other than having it hosted and applying some new enterprise features for Packer and HCP, and we can talk about that probably in another engagement. This is where most of like the OSS heavy load of OSS installs are. There is some Nomad, just for the sake of time, I've got to filter it down just a little bit. The patterns are going to be fairly similar between all of the products, as you'll see as we go. But there are some interesting nuance about why people move to Vault and Consul Enterprise maybe than Terraform. Terraform tends to be more about governance and control and compliance and so on. Oftentimes, Vault and Consul are primarily driven by the need for HA and resiliency. And so we'll touch on those as we talk about that move. And then we'll get into the nuance of how this changes how you work, what expectations your users should expect, and so on. For those who aren't familiar with see, now I'm stuck in the product land. With HashiCorp, HashiCorp is really focused on automating how we operate in a multi-cloud world. And so the idea here is that IT delivers all these various services, whether we're talking about provisioning or identity certificates, credentialing. These are all services that we have to provide in order to provide stable, scalable, resilient systems for developers and application deployers to work against. If I'm doing something COTS and I've got an application team that owns it, how do I enable them to move very, very quickly as they use package software or SaaS providers or whatever? And so there's a lot of tools that go into our portfolio. I won't spend a whole lot of time, describing the entire portfolio, but just understand that we do a lot in a lot of different areas, all the way out to application abstractions with something like Waypoint, where developer can just hand us a workload and say, deploy it. I really don't care how you deploy it. Just here's my workload. Here's my expectations for how it should run, take off. I see I've got some. Oh, excellent. Okay. Checking the audio there. We've got a lot of customers, a lot of install. And so the experiences that I'm going to share in this webinar are derived from at least my interactions with a number of customers, as well as obviously the team of experts that we have helping our customers be successful in the market. So I get the chance to work with a lot of our customer facing engineering teams. And so I hear these repetitive stories and patterns, things that cause us to sometimes struggle. But ultimately, if we're able to work our way through that, we see some outstanding benefits on the backside, just alleviated toil, less replicated work, and so on. So a couple of disclaimers as we get into this. Your mileage may vary. If you are working on a system that is already in a mission critical status, with Adobe Digital as an example, Vault was already serving 100 million IDs, and it was in the critical path for the way that digital media was being streamed. So we want to be very, very careful as we do these types of upgrades with it to introduce no disruption. And so I would say lean on expertise, lean on professional services teams that have done this before. Find somebody who's done this migration before, get their expertise and push through. So even if I give you some recommendations on how to think through, your Vault migration, or how to think through the way that you want to do your Terraform migrations, yes, you can do those things, and without outside help. I'm just saying, depending on the risk of the program that you're working against, understand that there's devil in the details, if you will. There's going to be nuance to the way you're leveraging your secrets engines. There's going to be nuance in the way that you're doing your ACLs at the console layer. And so having somebody with a really seasoned eye for what we need to do to migrate those ACLs into the new supported backplane or what have you, just take that into consideration, get that expertise. Don't just feel like, and I'm certainly not going to get enough detail. I'm not going to give you enough detail in this presentation that you would feel confident enough, I don't think, to just go out and pull the trigger and migrate something. But I want you to understand that these things will vary based on the complexity of your environment and how you've been using and implementing the OSS. We'll hit on a few of the things that cause your mileage to vary, but I just want to put that out as a disclaimer up front. So why do we see so many migration patterns? Obviously, it's because as an open source first company, a lot of our customers first experience us simply by downloading something off of Git, running our open source products, and oftentimes it leads to wild early success in fairly simple implementations. Now, sometimes those early implementations can be quite complex, but oftentimes it's not as many moving parts, and it's especially not a lot of it. It's not a huge team, so we're not downloading it into a team of 100, and then everybody starts using that OSS in a coordinated fashion. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, a relatively small team that's going to download the OSS and do some really interesting things around provisioning, around securing, maybe around some service mesh on a particular section of their services infrastructure. And so we can see a lot of wild success, and we see a little bit of viral adoption, which obviously is great for us. We love to get that feedback from the community. And it's also a signal back into HashiCorp that what we're providing has significant value. If we see this organic growth and downloading of the products, then we understand that the features that we're releasing are quality, and we can double down and we can enhance on those features, continue to refine them and improve. So it's a great bi-directional way for HashiCorp to engage with practitioners to grow the competency, the tools, the abilities that we can bring to the developer and operator fingertips. Over time, complexity enters into the picture. And if we are talking about something like Terraform is an example. We'll see an enterprise where Terraform is running on anything from a developer's desktop to a cloud account to wherever. And so we have this kind of diaspora of Terraform that's been put everywhere. Every one of these Terraform installs have sort of been built up from the ground up, and so we have distributed what in Google terminology we might refer to as distributed toil. We don't feel it centrally because it's not a single team that's recreating these environments over and over and over. We've just distributed it out. So maybe we've got 25 teams that are running open source Terraform, and they've built everything from the ground up, the way we want to manage state, the way we're going to do security around these things, what kind of encryption do we want to apply, how are we going to protect our credentials and variables and cloud credentials and so on that are going to go into these config scripts. So they're all having to reevaluate their environment and build it from the ground up. The other thing that we see begin to enter into that space is how do we do things like global policy enforcement? How many repos, if I needed to do an audit, how many repos and how many teams do I have to ask a bunch of questions to in order to understand if we are handling, as an example, let's say the networking team says, how are we provisioning load balancers? Can we find every repo that has a load balancer and understand its relative security? Do we have to buy holistic scanners that scan our entire environment and look for open IPs and challenge all of our kind of red team, kind of challenge all of our firewall constructs and see if we can defeat them, and then alert those teams. So as you can see, as we start to grow out and this complexity begins to extend, the multiplicity of open source consumption that's uncoordinated begins to become a significant challenge at a macro level. At the individual level, the individual operations teams may be perfectly happy with what they're doing. They're controlling everything end to end. It feels comfortable to them because that's the world that they live. And so you kind of have to understand the psychological ramifications, and we'll touch on those in a second as well. In general, the general approach to the way that we consider enterprise features versus OSS features is OSS are really geared towards making the operator, the operator, developer, whoever the tool is designed for, to make them wildly successful in whatever that task is. So if it's Terraform, OSS Terraform is designed to make it really easy, infrastructure as code, to plan your deployments, to deploy them, to see the benefits of having that active and managed state, allow you to control your world, your domain pretty well. And then as we start growing into enterprise, what we would consider sort of enterprise SKUs or paid for products, we're really getting into teaming and collaboration and policy and controls. So it's fine to have an open source when I'm talking about 5 folks that are inside a single code base, we'll say. I've got a repo, I've got all my modules and my source code. But as I get into 10, I start trying to figure out how to keep these teams from stepping on each other. Maybe I copy the entire repo into another repo, and then that way you've got some building blocks that you can get started on, but we're not going to be operating in the same instant. You install your own OSS, and now we have that bifurcation, and we have different standards being applied in both of those groups, and that problem begins to scale out. I think of it like a telephone game. We may have a centralized enterprise architecture team that has established a good set of, let's say, standardized modules that we intend for everybody to use. And maybe the first consumer is pretty right on. The second consumer is a little bit more divergent. And over time, once I get up to 30 or so installs of OSS, it's really hard for me to understand who is adhering to whatever the core modules are for Terraform, or maybe the core security policies that we're doing within Vault, or whatever, that needs to apply or be centrally enforced by, let's say, informed by the CISO strategy or whatever. So as we get into this, that's really what we're talking about is beginning to apply some centralization to an externalized control plane. We don't want to slow things down. So how can I drive this collaboration, improved operational footing, improved HA and resiliency, and also collaborate effectively with our GRC concerns. And so a lot of times the core driver for these, and the customers here are all focused on Vault, but I'll apply this a little bit more broadly in that we're often looking at HA and DR. How do I get a lot of concurrent runs through Terraform without people stepping on each other? It's going to be things like workspace segmentation. It's going to be RBAC controls, so individual teams can control their piece without getting it stepped on by other pieces. All of these things are going to come into play to allow us to scale the organization. When it comes to Vault and Consul, this will be things like namespaces or admin partitions, where I can allow a line of business to own its own multi-tenant. So think of it as multi-tenancy within multi-tenancy. I want them to own their own domain underneath a macro control plane, say, consider a Consul mesh of meshes. I want to allow them to scale their work out. And so the way that I'm going to be able to do that is by having these multi-tenancy style controls that come into the product, whether we're talking about RBAC, and so your roles will allow you to do certain things. In OSS, it's going to be sort of an open role. You can pretty much do everything. You can establish, some controls around that, and there are other ways that you can do that with some scaffolding, and we'll talk about that in a few. But the goal is those controls are more out of the box. You don't have to build and rebuild and rebuild and rebuild in order to address these concerns of scale and team management and state management and encryption policies, enforcement, all of that type of stuff over and over and over again, because I'm not dealing with all these little moats of product. I'm looking to drive a little bit greater standardization. And that means that I'm leaning more and collaborating more outside of the DevOps team. As these programs grow, we start understanding from, let's say, our CISO organization, the IT security group, that there are standards that need to be applied across the entire real estate. The way that we're going to do mutual TLS, as an example, or the way that certificates should be managed end to end. If we're talking about application workloads, the way we're going to do visibility tooling. Observability. So if we're going to do observability consistently across everything, how do I apply those standards? How do I work closely with these external teams so that our collaboration is clean and effective? And then, of course, the other benefit is that HashiCorp will support you, right? You're not just pinned to something like a community support line where you're looking at discussion boards and chat groups and so on. I'm probably dating myself. In general, the approach is going to look, and I'll just pick on Vault for a second. This is part of a presentation by a great friend of mine named Nick Young. There's a couple of videos. He recently updated the video for how to move from OSS Vault into Vault Enterprise with HSM for things like FIPS compliance and so on. So oftentimes Vault starts in this OSS world. It's not really, you can use whatever custom backend that you want to use. A lot of times we're seeing these days DynamoDB. And part of the reason why we'd see something like DynamoDB, Carl, it might be leaning on your keyboard there. One of the reasons we might see something like DynamoDB, it will replicate across maybe availability zones. So now I can run multiple OSS installs of Vault, but have them work against a replicated key storage, right? So I can have performance in each. That's perfect. So I can have performance in each one of those availability zones and resiliency between those Vault instances. And this takes a little bit of work to wrap this and get the logic right around Vault. And maybe you build some custom policy around your mount points. You can do some interesting things to try to provide governance and control around that Vault OSS, and then use a resilient backend to make sure that I'm consistent across, WAN separated segments. Maybe it's an Amazon availability zone. Maybe it's, you're not going to use DynamoDB if you're reaching across clouds, but within the cloud, I'll have some form of resiliency between, leveraging a cloud native data service on the back end. But over time, as folks begin to look at, well, I'd like to extend this to the on-prem database, and I may not want to go full, Amazon Outpost and run Amazon Cloud locally. Maybe I want to extend it into something that's more, normal for my my on-prem data center. And so I'm going to go into more of a self-managed HashiCorp Vault Enterprise kind of packaging, and I need to find a way to get those backends. Now, Vault Enterprise does limit your choices to a couple of supported backends. One is going to be the native backend, and then it may also use the Consul KV store. Either way, I need to have a supported backplane, because a lot of what we do at HashiCorp, you can imagine from an engineering effort perspective, if I'm going to build in resiliency at scale for my product that's just native to the install, I can't. It's really, really difficult to hire, you know, 1 million engineers to do that for every conceivable backend for Keystore. So the enterprise SKU is going to come with an integrated storage solution, and you could also use the Consul backplane, which was the original. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to migrate off of that backend storage. I'm going to go ahead and bring that in using the migrate config. I'm going to test and validate all that as a separate standalone. I'm going to take snapshots, backups. There's a lot of steps here just to make sure that we're very, very safe. And then I want to test and validate that, obviously, that I can get responses, I can retrieve keys, everyone's going to be served well before we turn off any existing system which is serving an enterprise need. So people are being offed all the time, and I don't want to disrupt that workflow. But once I have it tested and validated and I can switch traffic over to the new vault, I'll switch it over and close the old piece. And then if I want to do auto unseal with HSM, and I want to add some additional layers of security, maybe I have a FIPS 140-2 style compliance where those keys need to have additional complexity around the encryption. Then what I'll do is I'll set up a new vault cluster, set up very similarly to the way that I have my existing enterprise install. And then I'll basically set them up as a disaster recovery secondary. And then once they're fully synced up, I can sever the connection and see that the DR primary gets disabled. I will have a promotion ceremony, which elevates the new Vault Enterprise cluster. And now that gets promoted to my production primary. And then I can do other things like federate that out and replicate that in multiple cloud availability zones, on-prem, off, multi-cloud, whatever I want to do with it. But so the intent is not really to go through all of the details of what it will take to get the migration done, but just to give you a sense of the pattern for how that migration from OSS to enterprise can take place in something even sensitive like Vault that is handling production level load. Again, mileage will vary. There's going to be complexities, there's going to be nuance. Please do engage with an expert to help you walk through that. Now, I meant to put a graphic on this when I was playing around with it. In a similar fashion to what we saw with Vault, and so let me take a step back very quickly. One of the main reasons why we move out to something like Vault is the high availability resiliency, DR. There are elements of standardization and centralization around things like namespaces, but oftentimes the primary driver is HA and DR. In working with a good friend of mine, Dan McTier, built a large scale, actually, let me just go back to the Vault Enterprise, built a large scale Vault practice inside of Adobe Digital. And one of the things that he talked about is for about a year, they were working on HA and DR Vault solutions. Again, 1 trillion auths a year. We're talking a heavy mission critical system. And through all of their efforts, they had gotten it to I believe it was 3 nines resiliency. They felt pretty okay with that. They felt like that was something that they had built out. Obviously, they were working very, very diligently to improve it. And I think as he talks about it, and I forget the exact time, it was something like a month to get up onto Terraform Enterprise. But once they did that, they were immediately 4 nines minimum and improving. And so, if you're talking about the shift from 3 nines to 4 nines, a year of effort to get to 3 nines, a month of enterprise install, and we were at 4 nines. And for mission critical systems that really depend on your service, and then having the full scale support of HashiCorp behind you when there is some unplanned form of downtime made all the difference in the world. And it allowed their team to scale and do other things rather than focus so heavily on HA and DR. So oftentimes that's going to be a contributing factor to moving to the enterprise product. And it kind of makes sense to me. If you've got a team of, I think Dan started with 3 and himself, the 3 operators, and I think he was part of that, but was the leader of that group. As it grew out, they added a new individual for every 20 or so teams that onboarded to Vault, 20 application teams that moved on to Vault. Those, as they were moving things along, it was a matter of how do we scale the team most effectively if we're going to drive this as an enterprise program. And I think that's a key consideration for the move to an enterprise product. Is this an enterprise critical service? If so, let's consider how many folks we need to support it. If you rely on HashiCorp, we have a dev team who's been working on HA and DR for years. And it's all encompassed within the enterprise product set. If you're building it yourself with 3 or 4, obviously that's the trade-off, right? Time, effort. Will it be as rock solid maybe as our teams are? I've never seen it. I'm not trying to say that your engineering teams can't make it happen, but it's going to take time. It's taken us a lot of time working with a lot of customers to get it as bulletproof as we've gotten it. And I think that's obviously one of those key considerations for the move to something like enterprise. Now, as we consider things like Consul, again, and this is just a quick feature list. I'm not going to exhaust the feature list, but again, it's geared at that enterprise style use case. So if I'm going to, audit and control and centralization, if I've got pockets of Consul floating around, how do I conduct audit? I have everybody dump maybe to a heavy forwarder. I do something with Splunk, but I'm building the scaffolding to make sense of dispersed Consul instances that are not maybe the same versions. They're not implementing maybe the same policies. How do I determine that they're using the same ACLs or the same controls for how access can be granted? Are their certificates being managed consistently or in the same manner? Do they have different policies for how they're aging them out and replacing those X509s for mutual TLS? All of those things become question marks that are hard for me to answer when I'm dealing with a distributed bunch of various Consul instances. And very similarly to what we were talking about before, when we get into things like DR, HA, how am I constructing these multi-Consul installs that are federated together? How do I manage that federation, resiliency, et cetera, et cetera? And so as you'll see in the kind of the feature set, without walking through this really isn't a Consul session. It's just automated backups, automated upgrades, enhanced read scalability. So all of these have to do with, I'm at enterprise scale now, things are beginning to pop. I'm looking to roll this out maybe as a larger scale program where I'm getting into things like automating the physical networking infrastructure using Consul Terraform Sync. This is where it's gone beyond a simple mesh for 2 or 3 clusters of Kubernetes or whatever it is that I'm creating service networking around. It's gone way beyond that. So when we talk about things like admin partitions, that's again, how do I orchestrate the work? I want a mesh of meshes, if you will, a networking control plane, a service networking control plane that sits above all the various teams so that I have centralized audit. I can establish centralized policy, access controls, rights, et cetera. And then everybody can inherit those things without having to recreate the wheel every time they install an open source Consul. So again, and I gave you just kind of a sense of what it takes us to migrate, again, back it up, plan what you're doing. Are you having to upgrade to move to enterprise? That may require careful consideration of the way that you step upgrade to get to the right upgrade of OSS Consul. And then migrate over, or am I going to migrate over to an old version? There's all these kind of questions that we kind of walk through as a workflow. And then I began to determine how I was handling my access control lists and how do I migrate those over into the new backplane. And then I'm going to do things like a rolling restart do some traffic management. There's some nuance again to how we drive that migration, but I'm right now I'm focused on why is this, why would we make the move? And it's because we need to have this level of redundancy and quality. And so why would mileage sort of vary? And I'll point you to a bunch of lists and instruction sets on learn guides and things like that that will help you walk through your migrations or understand the level of work maybe that you're going to go after for the migration. So OSS complexity varies by customer. So the level of work, we'll say, of moving from OSS to enterprise is going to vary by customer. One large or healthcare organization that I was working with had 14, 15 Terraform installs that they were aware of. And they had established, as an example, a centralized enterprise architecture group who had built a library of reusable modules that everyone who was using OSS Terraform was required to consume. Those modules, I suppose, may have been a little bit complex. They were built in a fairly chunky way. A lot of customers that I've talked to will have 60, 70, upwards of 80 resources managed by a single HCL, open source HCL script. And we have kind of an internal rule where we start saying, well, if it takes you more than 2 minutes to deploy this thing, it's probably too big. It needs to be broken into smaller modules. But because I'm trying to abstract, or I'm trying to make things a little bit more coarse-grained, without, I suppose, without the aid of things like workspaces and work segmentation, I end up with larger and bulkier modules. And consequently, when I'm asking a team that doesn't have any idea what my module is really, I end up having to do a lot of hands-on mentoring. So every new dev team that would come in and pull down one of those modules needs to get somebody from the EA group to walk them through that complexity, as an example. So I'm not getting as much scale. I'm not getting the scale that I want out of that centralized process. And then oftentimes, once those teams are enabled, they may be making changes to those modules that I don't necessarily want them to change, but there's no way for me to enforce that. So maybe I build a policy checker, which one company that I was working with would produce a PDF file. So when you run through the plan, you were required to use an API as you came out of that plan, and it would run a comparison between the GRC policy side and the Terraform plan. And then it would come back with just kind of a list of violations and give that back to the operator who was going to push. There was no control to stop them from making the push. It just was like, hey, here's awareness. Here's the policy pieces that you need to pay attention to. And then there were elements of multiple customers that I've talked to built API sets to scan known repos and look for, compare the enterprise, core standard golden templates and golden modules with what's actually running out there. And then, I would email or send some form of an alert, which would be kind of that wrist slapping kind of thing of you're not using the standard modules that you should be using. But that's assuming I can find all of the repos. If somebody downloaded it to their laptop and came in outside of my the process or workflow, I have shadow IT, right? So as I'm talking about this, what I'm getting at is oftentimes we're building a lot of scaffolding. So the scaffolding, the level of work that's gone into the scaffolding to help us to become successful with OSS is one of those things that we have to consider as we start looking at the migration, because you will have written your modules to fit a different model, a less reusable model typically. And I'm using typically because I'm sure there are people who've done incredible jobs of building structure around the OSS. I haven't seen very many of those at scale. Most of what I see is a lot of what I'm describing here, a lot of lot of pieces around state management and encryption and replication and making those things available in other places and all that kind of stuff. But oftentimes this is a team of 10, 20, that are focused on trying to control a lot of this. Whereas folks who are starting with enterprise are starting with maybe 2 or 3, putting out a private module registry and making it easier to consume these things at scale in smaller pieces. So what I'm really referring to is the scaffolding piece. If I go back to the shift between how we're working before and after, to me, this is a bigger challenge in many cases, because in the early days of OSS, we have to deal with sort of the human piece of all of this. And humans love, especially engineers, love to create value and build something that they see as their unique differentiator in a given field. And so if I started in OSS and I built some great successes with the early OSS, and then a team comes in to try to impose something on me, I have this immediate reaction to that imposition. I'm driving superior results. We set ourselves apart by doing what we're doing here. I'm doing the best I can to meet all these standards, and here, let me show you. And so I'm going to have this kind of resistance that comes in, but at scale, we're going to have to change the way that we work a bit. I can't have you control everything anymore. I'm going to have you consume things a little more readily than build them from the ground up. And let me show you what that feels like. And so as you consider your programs, as you consider your migration efforts over from OSS into enterprise, I really believe that you need to consider the psychological impact, what you're asking a user to do, and consider the onboarding efforts to ease that, drive as much collaboration with those groups as possible, consume as much of their genius as you can possibly consume. What worked for you, what broke. Help me review this module that's going into the private module registry, because I really feel like what you've done can scale out to 1,000 teams, right? Just approach it in that way to drive greater and greater reuse, collaboration, and acceptance of, once you're consuming somebody else's work, it's easier for them to consume your work. They see themselves as collaborative partners. So it really needs to be done in this kind of collaborative way. Consider the ramifications of those intentions, that the incentives that you want to drive out, and then that's going to be key to making you successful at a programmatic level. And even though at a Terraform level, we would say, hey, HCL is HCL. I can run some of the kludginess that is in your open source HCL, but it's going to limit what we are attempting to do, which is make a very manageable micro infrastructure, reusable style deployment or reuse of infrastructure assets. If your modules are 80, 100, 200, resources under management in a single HCL file, it's not going to be terribly reusable. Nobody is going to want to consume that a second time. What it does, nobody else does. And nobody else has the time to read it over the weekend and try to figure out how that 100 resource HCL module, HashiCorp config language module, was built. So the whole idea behind moving to enterprise is, can I segment the teams where networking builds my networking controls? They build those modules small enough that it provides, it's sort of applying microservices thinking. Can I import your state? Yes, I can import your state. It's going to take a little bit of time. Here's a little set of instructions to show you how to take kind of existing state, move it into enterprise, and begin to work with enterprise. So that migration path, I can get there, right? I can get your OSS into enterprise. There is going to be some rework based on how you wrote your OSS, right? Maybe I consumed a big library from Vagrant or something like that. Well, those are not, they may not programmatically fit the reason that we're going to Terraform Enterprise. And I really don't want you to walk away from this thinking that this is an insurmountable hill. It's not insurmountable. It's just, what is the result that I want? Why would I move to enterprise? I want to move to enterprise because I want to collaborate. I want networking to own networking and storage to own storage and database to own database. And when you produce something that this is the standardized way that I'm going to consume Oracle on-prem, and it's going to be dynamically provisioned for me, or Snowflake, or accounts in Snowflake and data sets and so on. I want that produced by an expert that I can consume from in a think of it in microservices architecture style. I want smaller pieces that I can assemble into something that's much more extravagant. That makes it easier for me to do things like enforce policy, scan code, understand the quality of that module, etc. So if that's the goal behind the shift, not everything that I did in OSS is going to fit. And some of that OSS work is going to be hyper complex because it was built without those goals in mind, or without considering reuse broadly across the enterprise. And so this is where we have to deal with not just sort of the scaffolding or how the teams have been working. The teams have been working by collaborating with the enterprise architecture team and running this PDF scanning tool and then doing this and doing that, right? They've been working a certain way for a year. And I'm asking you to change the way that you work. And so I have to consider all of that, the workflow shift. I'm not can you continue to use the CLI? Of course, you can still use the CLI. So one of the nice things about Terraform Enterprise is you can still use the CLI very similarly to the way that you would use it in OSS land. But progressively, I'm looking at more of these integrations happening at the API, abstracting more of this through a UI and filling out a few fields, of variables, and then saying, give me that module with the variables that I asked for. But a lot of this is going to be consider the organization, consider how we're going to scale, how we're going to drive higher and higher levels of automation. And obviously, you're going to have to very carefully walk that psychological shift. So consider, and I'll close and open up for questions. Considerations as you grow. Vijay, I'll get to you in one sec. Don't neglect the sales and marketing aspect. You need to be constantly selling the benefits of what you're talking about. And from a collaborative standpoint, you need to be selling the brilliance of people who came before you as well. That's one of the ways that you can drive that collaboration. Hey, I love what you did with OSS. It's going to be complicated for us to consume that in the new world. But what you've done is exactly, in line with where we're trying to go from an infrastructure as code standpoint. Collaborate with us a little bit and help us understand how we can drive better reuse here. One of the considerations that I've seen prove fairly successful is this concept of a release engineer. So as I am moving from an OSS framework style approach to an enterprise style approach, you really having somebody that eases that transition is incredibly desirable. Consider the release engineer as a customer facing engineering person that will help onboard them into the new experience. They basically do the white glove adoption, especially of your early customers. And that release engineer may support, let's say, 10 engineering teams. I'm going to help you onboard. I'm going to help you shift from where you are to where we're going. I understand how Terraform is working with Vault and is injecting service networking with Consul. Let me get you going so that you understand how to get those service definitions where they need to go so the network intentions are correct and so on. So as I'm making these changes, as I am moving, the release engineer is a tight member of my core DevOps team that's helping to drive this move. And they are customer facing, working with the engineers. Over time, as my automation grows, maybe they're supporting 15 teams, then 20 teams each, and then 50 teams. And then I don't need the role anymore. So they become SREs working on the platform because my automation has become so clean. We become so institutionalized, if you will, that it's easy for people to get on board and do it. I've talked quite a bit about bringing in teams collaboratively. One of the examples is if we're doing something like a payment network that has to do lazy writes out to, batch commits out to a mainframe. How do I get the mainframe team bought into, as an example, Vault creating a RACF credential least privilege to do that file, to do that write out to the mainframe dataset? Can I engage with them? Can I talk to them about collaborating with us on how that credentialing needs to happen, what that permissioning needs to look like, what is the API gateway that's going to talk to you? And I'm sort of inviting them to join us on the journey, right? I'm bringing them closer and closer to the way that we're going to integrate with those back-end systems. And I'm helping people modernize skill sets. It's becoming a little bit of an organic learning kind of thing. And the last thing I'll say is very carefully consider your incentives. Don't come straight out of the box with a chargeback, like use my service and I'm going to charge you $100,000 a year for using my service. Like that's an immediate disincentive. I'm not saying chargeback is a bad approach to getting, to helping you fund the service that you're bringing forward, but just understand that that is a disincentive out of the box, and you need to find a way to overcome that or off the jump, if you will. But you need to find a way to overcome that disincentive in another fashion. Maybe it's that release engineer, maybe it's some consulting help or something, but it's going to be another form of expense, right? So I've established chargeback, and now I've established an expense to deal with the chargeback. So rather, I might consider my program incentive and say, let's not start out of the gate with chargeback. Let's do the white glove release engineering. We're going to be a little bit more expensive on the first 5, 6, 12 that we onboard. And over time, as we see how that consumption plays out, then I can work out what my chargeback pricing model looks like and say, hey, now you've seen these benefits. We've done our sales and marketing. Everybody understands the value that they're getting from this. Now this is where we feel we can begin to turn up a little bit. You have to understand, I've got to fund my team. It's going to come out of your operating budget at like this space starting in this quarter. Is that in line with the value that you're getting from our, you need to start thinking almost like an internal business. Here are the helpful tips and tricks, and that's it. So questions, I saw a raised hand. Yes, Vijay, can you unmute? Vijay? Yeah, Vijay, if you're talking, it looks like you're muted. I sent a request for, oh, there you go. Go for it.
Maybe you can put your question in the chat or in the Q&A section.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There you are.
Some issue in my mic, actually. It is not unmuting me. Okay. So I just wanted to check the migration piece. If I use the open source and, if we go for the enterprise pool, from the, world perspective, what kind of actually, prerequisites for that to migrate from open source to enterprise? Is there any prerequisites we should have in the environment we should be taking care of before we go ahead?
Yes. So and there's lots of materials out there. I gave you, let me back up one. Let's see, is it this one? So I'm going to include, I'll share this with you. There's a number of documents out there that will walk you through things like the migrations, prerequisites. We've got learn guides. There's more than I put here. I just put a handful of things such as like Ranjit's talk under Terraform is about how workflow changes. And so what your users should expect as they move. But he does a migration, shows kind of the differences in the way that you do the migration. On the Vault side, there's going to be production hardening guides. There's going to be migration guides. There's lots of things that will walk you through how to get done what you need to get done. I would say engage with some of our experts that bring that expertise. Your local SE systems engineer can provide you with some really detailed technical guidance as it comes to how you look at your environment and understand those nuances.
Okay, thank you, sir, very much. And one more quick question: is that possible to containerize the Vault stuff?
Yes. So there's actually a Helm chart for deploying Enterprise Vault. Yeah, you can certainly do a lot of different things with the packaging. One of the beautiful things about what we do at HashiCorp, and that's probably an overblown term, beautiful. That's one of our guiding practices, is that beauty is one of those things that we drive for when it comes to product. But one of the things that we would consider beautiful is that it's a binary. It's a relatively simple binary that can be deployed any way that you would like it to be deployed. And so if you want it in containerized and running on Kubernetes, do it. If you want it running bare metal, there's ways for us to do that as well. So yeah, the goal is that it can be run how you would like to run it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
One of the things I would talk about with the containerization is that sometimes you end up with, oh, did we lose him?
He's here, sir.
Okay, we may end up losing, as an example, consider things like the overlapping failure domains. So if I require Kubernetes to run, as an example, if I require Kubernetes to run Vault and I require Vault to run Kubernetes, I have to work out the mitigation strategy for that cyclical dependency. So a lot of customers tend to elect to run Vault external to the platform, but there's no, you can deal with that cyclical dependency. It's just one level of complexity that you need to think about when you have overlapping failure domains. If I lose Kubernetes and it brings down my Vault cluster, I need to already have Vault running someplace else to help with the recovery, or just a couple of things that you need to consider there.
And we have one comment in the chat as well.
One comment in the chat. Yes, no, I appreciate that. I've seen it so many times that I jokingly take things to kind of a hyperbolic level, but if it feels draconian, if it feels like oppressive, then I think humans have a natural desire to kick back against that. So really help people see it as an evolution, as something we're going to collaborate on. We're going to work really closely and capitalize on the genius. You were a forerunner. Really appreciate what just human appreciation, empathy. One of the things I have a deck on people and process, and one of the things that we're talking about that original team is you're hiring for great listeners, great empathy, people who want to see other people be successful. You can bring in your super technical geniuses who are a little bit lower on the social IQ level of kind of maturity later in the program to help manage the core systems and things like that. But early on, you really need to drive that empathetic, collaborative learning environment as you're making that initial move. Anything else? I know we're right at time. I really appreciate the time. This was something I was kind of building in the last couple of days. So thanks for listening. If you have any feedback, I would love to hear it. mwood, so just mwood at hashicorp.com. mwood. I'll just put it in the chat. Feel free to let me know what you think. If you've got counterpoints, I would love to walk through them. I'm not interested in offering, kind of unhelpful sort of advice. If I can steel man it and understand kind of how you see the world and those types of things, I would love to talk it out. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much.